Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. Today we're going to spend some time in this first hour talking about intelligent design, evidence for God, and even the whole issue of the Big Bang hypothesis. Before we get to that, we're going to spend just a moment, as we like to do, giving you an update. I am so frustrated, as I suspect some of you are, with various organizations that raise money, and they never know how it went and how well you did. And especially when I'm out traveling around, many times people are asking, well, how did you do on that particular fundraising event? Or are you doing okay? And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring the president of Point of View, Warren Kelly, in studio. We finished our fiscal year end last week, and you've totaled up the numbers. How did we do?
We did meet our match. We had a $30,000 match on the table from several of our listeners that had put that together, and we are very thankful for each and every one that gave to that to help us reach that match, and it helped us to close out our fiscal year just a little bit ahead of where we were the previous fiscal year. We'd hoped for a little bit more growth than we saw, but we're very thankful for what we did get. So it was a good year.
Yeah, I think so. And again, we really value the gifts of individuals, and that's why I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about money, but I do want our listeners to know that in this time with sometimes a down economy, and a number of our listeners have had some very significant struggles when they sit down and try to decide how much they might give to their church and to other Christian organizations, even to this radio station that carries this program. I'm just very grateful that they considered us worthy of their support as well.
Very much so. We recognize that many of our listeners give very sacrificially, that it's a choice that they have to make that's not an easy one, and we appreciate the gifts that they make. Without that, we wouldn't be able to do the things that we do. You wouldn't be on the air every day reaching people across the nation.
Well, and again, some of the things that we've been talking about in the past, and we'll do this in the future, we have our own satellite signal. We have YouTube channels. There are just a lot of things that their financial resources go to, in addition to just the 2 hours of broadcast, but all the other things that we're doing behind the scenes as well.
Right. There are a lot of people listening to the radio today. Over the course of the week, Point of View reaches about 1.4 million people. If you add to that the online listeners, we're about 1.5 million people that are reached every week, learning how to apply biblical truth to every area of their lives, and it only happens because of the gifts of our listeners, people like you that give.
Well, again, I want to say thank you to all of you, but also I thought we'd come back to the Cradle Fund. You remember on Monday we had Johnny Moore on the program, and he was very thrilled that we were able to raise those funds, and 100% of the gifts to the Cradle Fund went to the Cradle Fund. That we were just a pass-through to that, and that was a way to help fellow brothers and sisters in the Lord who are finding themselves in refugee camps and displaced because of ISIS. And back then, we were talking about having raised about, $35,000.
Right.
You have, I guess I need a drum roll here, we have a new number that's come in just in the last couple of days.
Just the last couple of days, we've had several people that have stepped up, and we are now up to $45,000. So just in the last 3 or 4 days, we've had another $10,000 that has come in to help with the Cradle Fund, and we're very grateful for that.
Well, again, that is something we did, and again, I give full credit to Warren Kelly, who, after he heard that first interview we did with Johnny Moore on his book, Defying ISIS, that, we need to do something. It's one thing to talk about it. It's another thing to maybe stand up and say, we want to, as a community of those people that listen to Point of View, make a difference, and I really, again, thank our listeners. I know some of them may have given both to Point of View and to the Cradle Fund. A lot of them gave just to the Cradle Fund. That's great, because I'm glad that they had a chance to help other Christians around the world. So thank you for that idea. and up to $45,000. I guess we'll wait till it stops coming in to send that last check.
It slows down a little bit.
But it's going very well. Well, Warren Kelly, thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure.
We're going to spend some time today talking about this new book, God of the Big Bang, How Modern Science Affirms the Creator. And it is written by Dr. Leslie Wickham. She was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest, had a political science degree from Willamette University in Salem, Oregon. I went to Oregon State, so I can relate to that. Earned a master's degree as well as a doctoral degree from Stanford University. Now, she's worked as an engineer for Lockheed Martin, also has had the opportunity to work on NASA's Hubble Space Telescope and International Space Station programs. She also has moved and many times to the what are called the WET labs in Universal City. She also is a professor at Azusa Pacific University, and in addition to all of that, has played women's professional football and has traveled quite a bit with Athletes in Action. So, Dr. Wickham, thank you so very much for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
I think some people might have even seen your TED Talk, and we have some ways in which people can follow you in a little more detail. But one of the things we do on this program with some frequency is talk about apologetics, how to defend the Christian faith. We also talk about intelligent design. I've got a book called A Biblical Point of View on Intelligent Design, and we spend some time talking about this. And this book is kind of in that same genre because it is really saying that we don't have to believe that science is against our Christian faith. Really, if anything, the more we learn about the science, especially in astronomy, the more we recognize that we live in a universe that is just right, and I think really shows the fingerprints of a creator, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, my view of who God is expanded tremendously because of what we've learned through science. And in addition to being an apologetics tool, I really feel like this is something where you guys were talking earlier about, various missions and whatnot. This presents a mission opportunity for us to reach, especially students, I think, who are struggling with the idea that science and faith might be in conflict. And what I see at the university level is a lot of students who've come in already having decided that they had to choose either faith or science. And to me, that's just criminal. We need to do something about that.
Well, we certainly do. And as a matter of fact, the latest book by David Kinnaman, who is with, of course, the Barna Research Group, found that was one of the deal breakers, that sometimes young people growing up in a church, it could be a fundamentalist church, or it could just be well-meaning Christians, say, either you have to accept the Bible or you have to believe in science, but you can't choose both. And so they go, well, these professors look pretty smart, and I love my pastor, but he doesn't have a PhD, and this one does, so I guess I'll have to jettison my faith. You and I are examples of individuals that have science degrees that survived it, but that false choice is one that I know you address in the book, and it's certainly one that we're going to certainly try to address today here on the program, don't you think?
Yeah, sounds great.
Well, let's, if we can, take a natural break, and then we're going to come back and get into this in some detail. After all, Psalm 19 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of his hands." If indeed that is something that was true back then, in light of how much more we know about science, do we have evidence for the existence of God? Can we prove God? Well, no more than you can prove anything. Science can't necessarily prove something, but it can certainly falsify things. But if you're looking for very compelling arguments for the existence of God, when we come back, we're going to look at some of those. They have big terms like the cosmological argument or the teleological argument, but we'll break those down. And I think if we've done our work effectively, at the end, you're going to say, whether we look in the telescope or the microscope, whether we look in the far dimensions of space or whether we look in the smallest dimensions of space, we see evidence for design. And design implies a designer. And so I think this is going to be an encouragement to you as well. Dr. Leslie Wickham with us today, and we are privileged to have an individual that is a rocket scientist, a corporate astronaut, and engineer at one time on NASA's Hubble Space Telescope and the International Space Station, individual that is also director of the Center for Research and Science at Azusa Pacific University. We're going to have our conversation with her, and then, as always, open up the phones to give you a chance to join the conversation as well. Stay tuned. We'll have more right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kirby Anderson.
You know, whenever we have a shooting in America, there is the inevitable call for more gun control, and the focus is usually on the guns rather than the people who are using the guns. In his new book, American Contempt for Liberty, professor and columnist Walter Williams has a previously published column asking, "Are guns the problem?" He reminds us of a few historical facts. A century ago, the National Rifle Association helped establish 73 NRA-affiliated high school rifle clubs. I've even had people call my radio program talking about how they used to bring their rifles to school, set them in the back of the classroom, and go out shooting after class. Walter Williams also writes about gun availability. Catalogs and magazines from the 1940s through the 1960s were full of gun advertisements directed to children and parents. One article provided guidance to parents. The National Shooting Sports Foundation published what every parent should know when a boy or girl wants a gun. The 1902 Sears mail order catalog had 35 pages of firearm advertisements. In previous generations, if you wanted a gun, you could send in your money and the manufacturer would ship the gun to you, or you could walk into a hardware store and buy a gun. Few states even had age restrictions on buying guns. So Walter Williams asked an obvious question. Why at a time in our history when guns were readily available, when a person could just walk into a store or order a gun through the mail, when there were no FBI background checks, no waiting periods, no licensing requirements, was there not the frequency and kind of gun violence that sometimes we see today when access to guns is more restricted? Good question. We can point to other factors, the breakdown of the family, the loss of moral standards, as well as violence on television and the movies. We can make a long list. It isn't the gun that's the problem. It's the person and his or her mind and heart that are usually the problem. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, for the next hour, we're going to look through the telescope, well, at least figuratively, although perhaps some of you are like our Day 4 Christian astronomy group out there the other day looking at the conjunction of Venus and Jupiter. But we're going to talk about what we see through our telescope, and we're guided by Dr. Leslie Wickman, who is the author of this new book, God of the Big Bang. It is published by Worthy. We have information about her and the book on our website, pointofview.net. Let's, if we can, Dr. Wickman, look at some of the arguments for the existence of God. And one of those is the cosmological argument, which is really very simple. That is, everything has a cause and effect. Well, then there should be a first cause. And if you have a belief in the Big Bang, let's just assume that all scientists accept that, although there may be some intramural debates about how and when and all that, then it would certainly seem to suggest that there has to be something behind the Big Bang. And since the Big Bang created both time and space, whatever is behind it has to be outside of time and outside of space. Can you think of any possible candidates?
Well, yeah, one major one comes to mind pretty quickly, doesn't it, for you?
Yes. Well, and talk about that, because how does this idea of a cosmological argument square with what you know of astronomy?
Yeah. Well, as evidence grows for the Big Bang, it points to, the main thing I try to emphasize is that it simply points to a beginning of space, time, matter, and energy. And as you so eloquently explained, anything that begins to exist must have a cause for its existence. And so if the universe had a beginning, then it has to have a cause, which is separate and apart from it. And, this idea of cause and effect, and that all effects have causes dates way back to Plato and Aristotle. It's not something that has come about recently. But with the growing evidence for the Big Bang, the fact that we're seeing the universe expanding and that the redshifts of galaxies farther away from us are greater than those that are closer to us. And so we have this evidence that the universe has been expanding for a very long time. And so if we basically just say, okay, you know what, we're going to just run the video in reverse. In other words, if everything is expanding farther and farther away from everything else now, then if we go backwards in time, everything was closer together. So that shows that the universe had to be everything in the universe had to be much closer together. And then from there, we look at this idea of a Big Bang beginning or a creation event, where the universe actually came into being. And so, in fact, many of the scientists who were on the cutting edge of realizing that there was evidence for this Big Bang beginning were very uncomfortable with it initially. And, people like Einstein and Hoyle were very uncomfortable with the idea that the universe had a beginning, because that ran contrary to the prevalent theory before that, which was a steady state theory. I mean, in other words, that the universe had always existed. And it kind of reflected Carl Sagan's famous statement, the universe is all that is, all that ever was, and all that ever will be. And if it were self-existent or always existing, then there would be no need to explain a beginning. And so people, when they started realizing there was more and more evidence for this Big Bang beginning, started commenting about how everybody was running off to join the First Church of Christ of the Big Bang.
Well, and I think that's kind of interesting because, as you point out, the first words you hear on the Cosmos series, which was one of the most watched series in the history of PBS, because not only was it shown on television, but then they made available, back then when they had videotapes, those of you who are younger, videotapes preceded DVDs, but anyway, they made those videotapes available to various science classes, and so probably more young people saw that, and the first words, like you said, are the cosmos is all there is, ever was, or ever will be. But if you have a beginning, that kind of changes everything, because then you have the question, what happened 5 minutes before the Big Bang? And I remember when I was at SMU a number of years ago when Carl Sagan was alive, he had that question asked from the audience. And it's a good question, because indeed it comes back to that question of beginnings. If something is eternal, you don't have to ask where it came from. The question you always get is, where did God come from? Well, if God is eternal, he never had a beginning, so you don't have to ask where he came from. If the universe was eternal, you wouldn't have to ask where it came from. But since it is having a beginning, it does, I think, raise a very significant question. And the only answer, Dr. Wickman, I hear some people coming up with is maybe this idea of maybe there are multiverses, maybe there are many universes, and so we're just one fortuitous accident. But it doesn't really answer the question. And I think a good example is Genesis 1 and 2 give a much more sound philosophical and theological as well as scientific answer than what I'm hearing from some of the secular scientists right now.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, it begs the question, if there was a beginning, then who began it? Who was behind it? What was behind it? What caused it? And even if we do live in a multiverse, and by the way, my God is big enough to be God of a multiverse too.
I agree with that.
My view of God just keeps expanding with what we learn through science, and even if we do live in a multiverse, those multiverses are supposedly, if we give an ear to the speculation that's taking place about the possibility of multiverses, is that they pop into existence. And so, and even if you read, Stephen Hawking's Grand Design, I don't know if you read that book,
Sure.
It came out a couple of years ago, but, he basically says that you have to have gravity. Gravity has to exist. And he says that if you have gravity, if you grant the existence of gravity, then universes will be inevitable. Well, okay. but where did gravity come from?
You're back to those first principles. It's turtles all the way down, as one of the lines was used. And you mentioned Fred Hoyle, because later on he said, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics. Or George Greenstein said, as we survey all the evidence, the thought insistently arises that some supernatural agency, or he says rather agency with a capital A, must be involved. And he says, is it possible that suddenly, without intending to, we have stumbled upon the scientific proof of the existence of a supreme being? And so I think those are, kind of comments you're getting now from scientists looking at something as simple as the Big Bang.
Right. And if we just, consider Occam's razor, the idea that the simplest, robust explanation has more explanatory power is more likely to be the correct one. So Paul Davies makes some statements about this and saying that, what's more in tune with Occam's razor, the most simple explanation of surveying all this immense wonder and precision and synergistic design of the universe, how everything works together so perfectly to support life. Is it appealing to the idea of an infinity of unseen universes, such as a multiverse, or is it to say that somebody created it that way?
We certainly should tell our listeners that this book is quite readable, whether you have a scientific background or not. And even though we've used one big word, cosmological argument, really this is very readable, and you don't have to know quantum physics. You don't have to understand some of the latest scientific evidence. And you even have a chapter in here in which you spend a little bit of time showing, if anything, that logic helps us understand not only the science, but also the revelation that we have in the scriptures, because you have addressed that. So when we come back, let me take another one of those important principles. The first one is, of course, cause and effect. The other one is the issue of design, because we have had various people on this program talking about the fact that, well, for example, one of the co-authors of the book, Privileged Planet, and others like William Lane Craig and Ravi Zacharias, using some of the other arguments for the existence of God. And we'll see whether or not, as we look at the universe, whether or not it is, to use a good phrase, a Goldilocks universe. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. Not too big, not too small, but just right. And so we're going to continue our conversation today with Dr. Leslie Wickman. Her book is entitled God of the Big Bang. We have a link to her website, and I think you would really want to go to that website. If you have a young person that's at home and may be interested in science, this would be a great website for him or her to go to and to see a little bit more about some of the things that Dr. Wickman is writing about and have actually been dealing with for some time. The book, of course, might be available in your local bookstore, but if not, we have a link so that you can order it there. And we've got video and some other things that you might want to watch, as well as the article that she wrote for CNN, Does the Big Bang Offer Proof of God? So lots of resources there today so that you can get to know her a little bit better and get some of these very helpful, if you will, tools for your apologetic toolbox. As we go to a break, let me just mention that just a few minutes ago we did talk about the fund, the Cradle Fund, and if you have not given to that, we're about ready to send off our last check to help out those Christians who have been persecuted by ISIS. And if you have not done so, you might want to click on that button at pointofview.net. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Leslie Wickman and, of course, with you right after this.
Point of View's fiscal year ended last week, and the mailroom, well, they're still tallying up the final gifts to come in, even today, even within the last hour. So we still don't know an exact total, but what we do know, it looks like we met the full match. You stepped up, you gave, and other friends doubled your gift, and for all of that, we continue to be most grateful. Thank you. Point of View is your voice for truth, and your gifts help us continue keeping you informed and equipped for the challenges and opportunities of our time. Thank you one more time for partnering with us. And if you missed out, I assure you your support remains needed in this year. You can still give at pointofview.net. By mail, Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or by phone, 800-347-5151. 5151. That's 800-347-5151. And pointofview.net. Thank you. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Leslie Wickman, and if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Her book is entitled God of the Big Bang. But Leslie, just before we get to the book again, I thought I'd mention that we have posted that blog post that you put up. This time last year, many of our listeners might remember when they found evidence for gravity waves in the cosmic microwave background radiation. That's kind of technical, I know, for some people, but it's part of the Big Bang. And that's when the editor invited you to write a piece, Does the Big Bang Breakthrough Offer Proof of God? So we've posted that on our website. And that really began not only this, but at the same time, I believe that was when an editor approached you about writing this book. Am I correct?
That is correct. Yeah, it was really surprising to me how much interest it spurred, but exciting at the same time.
Well, and you look at Eric Metaxas, he writes a piece in, of all things, Wall Street Journal about intelligent design, and that's one of the most read pieces. So I think there's a real need for your book, and certainly a need for people to go to your website. And as I said just a minute ago, one of my goals always has been to encourage more Christian kids, students, to go into the sciences. I mean, there has been a tendency sometimes in the church to be afraid of the sciences. And, you know, I recognize I've seen a lot of kids lose their faith when they go off to college, and some of those happen in science classes. But I really think that we need to be on the forefront, especially with all the questions we have with stem cell research, robotics, and, of course, the exploration of not only the stars, but of our own planet and galaxy and all those kinds of things. We really need Christians involved in that. So I certainly want to encourage people to learn a little bit more about what you're doing, and hopefully see that a ministry, if you will, in science is a very good calling.
Absolutely. God needs people everywhere, and maybe most especially in the sciences these days.
Well, let's see if we can talk about evidence for the fine-tuning of the universe. In your book, you talk about a book that you read a while back, The Remarkable Spaceship Earth. I mentioned The Privileged Planet. You even have secular people writing about that. Peter Ward and Donald Brownlee wrote that book, A Rare Earth, Why Complex Life is Uncommon in the Universe. This is not what you expected, because back to Carl Sagan, he was convinced that the universe was just going to be brimming with life. But now we see that there are so many parameters, fine-tuned parameters, that have to be just right in order for us to have complex life. Explain that if you might.
Yeah, there are just so many things that have to be just exactly right, and people refer to it as the anthropic principle, the Goldilocks principle, the fine-tuning principle, but they all say the same thing, basically that there is a very long and ever-growing list of parameters that have to be finely tuned within just a very narrow range of values in order to get life, not just on Earth, but anywhere in the universe. And these are things like the strength of the universal gravitational constant, the speed of light, the mass ratio between the various subatomic particles, the strong nuclear force that holds the protons and neutrons together in the nucleus. I mean, all these things have to be just exactly right, balanced on a knife edge, or we don't get life anywhere. And one of my friends actually at Reasons to Believe, I don't know if you're familiar with the Ross organization. But one of my colleagues there did a calculation of the probabilities of getting all of the parameters just exactly right, and came up with an estimate of odds of 1 chance in 10 to the 282nd power. And that is so incredibly remote. I mean, to put that number in perspective, there are only 10 to the 80th estimated atoms in the entire universe.
Right.
So even if we had 10 to the 80th universes in our quote-unquote multiverse, picking just the right atom out of all those universes would still be only 1 chance in 10 to the 160th power, which is way short of the odds for this anthropic principle. And another analogy is to say that it's like one person buying just one lottery ticket each time they play and winning on the one ticket that they buy each time twice a week, every week for 50 years in a row. And I share that number and that analogy with my astronomy students, and I asked them, if you read that in the paper, what would your response be? And they said, well, it was rigged.
Yeah.
I said, bingo.
It was rigged.
It's exactly what you can say about the universe, is it's rigged for life.
You know, in my book, I talk about 322 parameters, but again, you get up with 10 to the 300th power, whatever it is. Those numbers are just beyond imagination. And I sometimes like to say to my secular atheistic friends, you're kind of betting your eternal destiny on those numbers. To believe that all of this happened as a cosmic accident takes a lot more faith than I've got. But the response I sometimes get, and I'd like to hear about your response, is that, and it's kind of in that book, Rare Earth, some of the secular people, well, we just hit the cosmic lottery. The fact is that because everything came together, then we have intelligent life so that we can perceive that this was an unusual event. But still, that's a really difficult proposition to hold to. And I think it begins to answer one of the questions I know you get all the time, and that is, are we alone in the universe? And we've talked about this book before, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, because it does seem to me that most of the UFO appearances are probably easily explained from some kind of natural phenomenon or misinterpretation. But there are a few, which we maybe can talk about in just a few minutes, that might be spiritual in the sense that they might be deceptive. But it does say that the idea that Carl Sagan used to have, that there's just got to be all sorts of life out there, and the LE airways in contact just need to get their radio telescopes in the right area, and then we'll be able to communicate with other life forms. So far, we haven't found any evidence in any kind of transmission so far that there's any other life out there, right?
Right. That's a very good point. In fact, if you think back to the beginning of the space program, when we start, or even actually before that, when we started transmitting radio waves and listening for radio waves, we've had antenna dishes pointed at the sky for a pretty long time now. And if we just go back to the time that we were really pointing at the sky and communicating with satellites, and therefore in a position to receive transmissions from space, that was back, in the 60s. So that's 50 years ago now. So if we had been able to pick something up that we could interpret as an intelligent signal over the last 50 years, that would say that we would have detected some intelligence within 50 light years. And so far, we haven't picked anything up in that volume and in that historical window, if you will, which tells us that there's probably nothing within 50 light years of us that could be considered an intelligent civilization. And when we start, lately we've had great progress through NASA's Kepler mission and other missions that have looked for extrasolar planets around other stars. And we've been detecting a lot of them, but even the ones that are referred to as Earth-like planets, in that they're in the Goldilocks zone of their star, and they're not massive Jupiter-like planets. They may be capable of having liquid water. Even if they're a little bit off in terms of the size, which, the ones that we've detected so far are pretty much all quite a bit larger than the Earth, that means that they're going to have a much stronger gravity. And one of the real interesting things about that is our gravity is finely tuned so that it can hold on to abundant amounts of H2O, water vapor in our atmosphere, which is essential for our life-giving water cycle. Well, the H2O molecule weighs 16 grams per mole, and our gravity is just strong enough to hold on to large quantities of that. If we look at methane and ammonia is 17 grams per mole, and methane is 18 grams per mole. No, you know what? I got that backwards.
Yeah, methane is 16 and 17, and water's 18. Yeah.
Water's 18, yeah.
Right.
Methane and ammonia are
That's
16 and 17, yeah. So our gravity is just strong enough to hold on to the water vapor at 18 grams per mole.
Just barely heavy enough.
So it's barely heavy enough. Methane and ammonia, which are poisonous in large quantities, are so light that Earth's gravity is not strong enough to hold on to large quantities of it. And therefore, we don't have large quantities of either in our atmosphere. So if our gravity was just a little bit stronger, we'd have a lot more of the methane and ammonia, and our atmosphere would be poisoned.
It certainly would. When you take a break, when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about some of those. I mean, the Earth's distance from the sun, Earth's size, Earth's atmosphere, the Earth's magnetic field, the Earth's 24-hour rotation, the Earth's axial tilt. the moon, which is so important, as well as the Earth's crust, liquid water, to mention just a few of the many parameters. They have to all be just right for us to have complex life right here on Earth. It's a pretty compelling argument. We'll continue that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Leslie Wickman with us for a few more minutes as we talk about her book, God of the Big Bang. And you know, Leslie, we've been talking about some of those parameters that make life on this earth possible. But in the book Privileged Planet, they also talk about some other things because, for example, we have a solar eclipse that we can see here on Earth, and that's because the moon is 1/400th the size of the sun, and the sun is 400 times further away from the Earth than the moon. And so they make the case that it's also one of the best places for observation. And for those of you that are astronomers, that's called what? Job security. You know, there's just a lot to be able to investigate. And so to believe all of this is a coincidence, again, comes back to a statement I make sometimes. I just think it takes a lot more faith to be an atheist than it does to be a Christian, to be perfectly blunt. What are your thoughts about that?
I absolutely agree. In fact, it's kind of interesting. One of my astronomy students, when he was doing one of his observation projects, wrote in his log that he felt like when he was out observing the sky and, you know, doing some specific observations for class, he felt like God was whispering in his ear, "I want to be found out." Wow. And I just think that's so beautiful. I mean, I really believe that God did put us in this place where we have a transparent atmosphere, for crying out loud.
Sure.
And
Right place in the galaxy,
also,
so we can see this. And those of us that get out there and get mosquito bit while we're actually looking through those telescopes and really enjoying God's wonder can really agree with David, who said the heavens declare the glory of God. And in some respects, we know more about the glory of God in this 21st century than they knew in the Old Testament. And so I think it's an exciting time to be a scientist. So I guess I have to get to one issue, because I know our listeners right now are going, wait a minute, you said something about UFOs, but you said there are some that defy explanation. And so let's come back to that, because in the book Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, which you quote, and also in your book, you point out that most of the things that are UFOs are probably easily explained. And when I have somebody tell me they saw a UFO and they'd been drinking that night, it was 3 a.m, I don't tend to hold that as very good scientific evidence. But some of these observations defy physical explanation. I mean, they make 90-degree turns and things like that. Do you have an answer for those kinds of questions?
I don't think it's anything new that the guys that wrote Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men didn't talk about, and others have talked about this too, that these things that apparently violate the laws of physics are most likely not physical objects that would be bound to the laws of physics, and so they're probably things like that would either be some kind of an optical illusion or possibly some sort of a spiritual deception, as you referred to earlier. I think, one of the things, I don't want to change the subject, I promise I'll get back to this, but one of the things that I've been kind of observing in kind of the forefront of science is that, we're looking at string theory and quantum mechanics and things that are really at the cutting edge of science, where we're starting to talk about possible additional dimensions. Not only of physical space but also of time. And to me, that just paves the way for us to have a better insight or glimpse into the miraculous and how God can perform miracles without violating the very laws of physics that He designed and ordained. And to me, that's just so exciting to have science shed light on something that is so connected to God's character and how He acts in the world.
I would agree. And as a matter of fact, we can do some mathematical equations to estimate what an extra-dimensional being like God would be like. And one of the things that surface out of that is how a God who is not bound by space and time, by our 4 dimensions, could hear all the prayers simultaneously in the world. I mean, we can't imagine that in our own finite minds, but we can run the mathematical equations, and I won't go into those because everybody will turn off their radio. But, those are the kinds of things that science today is answering that have been kind of troubling theological questions in the past. Yeah.
And just a real simple way to think about that is, even we as 3-dimensional creatures can envision a grid, a 2-dimensional grid of time where, we are personally constrained to move in linear time. It moves in one dimension, one direction. But if we can say, okay, but what if time is 2-dimensional and then it looks like a sheet of paper and we or other beings can move back and forth across that piece of paper rather than just in the linear dimension of time that we experience? What if you can do that? Well, that enables you to be everywhere at once.
Sure.
And
or to appear and disappear in the resurrection body of Jesus, too. I mean,
how a God who is not bound by our linear, one-dimensional perception of time can be everywhere at once. And so anyway, but if you want to get back to the question of life in the universe, I'd love to.
We're just about out of time, but I guess the bottom line is that maybe there's life in the other parts of the universe. I've seen you say this before. God could have created life in other parts of the universe, but as best as we can tell, in our corner of the universe, which is pretty large now that we have radio waves to measure, doesn't seem to be any, and so if nothing else, we need to pay attention to what God is doing in our lives here and recognize that if nothing else, that we need a creator and we need Jesus Christ. And I know that's one of the reasons why you've written this book, to really challenge people to think about the fact that, if anything, science and religion are not at loggerheads. If anything, some of the best scientific evidence today is really confirming the book of Genesis.
Absolutely. I think the more we learn from science, the more it confirms what we know about God and helps us understand better who God is and how awesome He is and how amazingly creative He is and is evidenced in His universe.
Let me just mention real quickly before we let you go that we have a link to your website. It's leslieannwickman.com, and people can find it there. If they also go down a little further, they can order the book. If they can't find it in their local bookstore, we have a video to watch, which I think they would really enjoy, your TED Talk, as well as we have that piece that was in CNN, Does the Big Bang Offer Proof of God? So if this is the first time, as many of us are getting to know you, I thank you so very much for joining us on the program, and this will be a way that they can find out a little bit more and maybe encourage others to investigate the scientific discoveries and see that it really does point to the existence of God. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much, Kirby. It was my pleasure.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to change topics. But let me commend to you this book, God of the Big Bang. It is published by Worthy. You perhaps will find it in your local bookstore, about 200 pages. And again, it takes on all sorts of issues. We've only covered a few. She spent some time, obviously, talking about some of the arguments for the existence of God and the Goldilocks principle. There's chapters in there about environmental stewardship. After all, indeed, if we are on a fine-tuned planet, we need to make sure that we are good stewards of that planet as well and take care of those issues. And so we have quite a bit to address. And of course, in that last chapter, are we alone in the universe? So I think you're going to find it really interesting to read. And I hope you'll take the time to get a copy of it and maybe pass it on to somebody that has an interest in science. Even if they're not a Christian, I think they would start reading through this and get drawn in by the evaluation that is being done by an individual who has been an astronaut, a rocket scientist, an engineer, and now a professor at Azusa Pacific. We're going to take a break, but if you would like more information about everything we've talked about today, it's on the website, pointofview.net. We also do have one more day, I guess, the Cradle Fund posted, but then we're going to send off a check. So if you have been wanting to do something, now's the time to take some action. When we come back, we're going to focus on Planned Parenthood and the whole problem of abortion, and especially one woman's testimony. I think you'll find it powerful. So let's take a break. Visit the website, pointofview.net. We'll be back with more right after this.
Point of View's fiscal year ended last week, and the mailroom, well, they're still tallying up the final gifts to come in, even today, even within the last hour. So we still don't know an exact total, but what we do know, it looks like we met the full match. You stepped up, you gave, and other friends doubled your gift, and for all of that, we continue to be most grateful. Thank you. Point of View is your voice for truth, and your gifts help us continue keeping you informed and equipped for the challenges and opportunities of our time. Thank you one more time for partnering with us. And if you missed out, I assure you your support remains needed in this year. You can still give at pointofview.net. By mail, Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221, or by phone 800-347-5151. That's 800-347-5151. And pointofview.net. Thank you.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kirby, for keeping this show so on track, and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to talk about some of the tactics of Planned Parenthood, and we're going to do that by pulling from a very good article that appeared in the Stream. And of course, you perhaps are now familiar with that particular news magazine and venue for various articles. We've had John Smirik in studio with us. We've had Jay Richards and others. And one other individual that works with that is Amelia Hamilton. She is the contributing associate editor of the Stream and is a conservative blogger and author of the Growing Patriot series of children's books, which we might talk about a little bit later. Lifelong writer and patriot, also loves Red Wings hockey and old cars, old movies, and when you hear Red Wings, you kind of know which part of the country she lives in. So, Amelia, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, it's great to be here.
The article that we have posted is one that you've written. Abortion clinics don't care about the mother, one woman's story. And you tell the story of Tina. And I thought maybe we'd just sit back for a little bit and have you tell the story, because I think it is really important to maybe set aside some of the myths that people have about a person, in most cases, of course, a woman, but sometimes influenced by a man, that decides to go to an abortion clinic. And this story is a powerful one that you've written about, and it's one that I wanted to first put on the table for discussion, then, of course, open up the phones to get some comments. But tell us the story about Tina, if you might.
Sure. Well, Tina, this happened a few years ago. She was a professional woman in her 20s and dating a guy pretty seriously, and found herself pregnant. They had been using some birth control that didn't work. And she was pressured into getting an abortion and found that at the clinic, as the title says, they just really don't care about the women at all. It's just kind of a production line almost. They bring women in, they show them a video about, how to feel better about your abortion, trying to help them, not even help them, but trying to make that decision seem like it's not such a big deal. The doctor himself comes into the room. He didn't even speak one word to Tina. He just came and did the procedure. The baby was put into a container marked medical waste, and that was the only time she saw her baby. And then she was sent on her way. I mean, it's not an industry that cares about women as much as they, use women's rights and things like that in their marketing. This is not a way to care for women.
And again, one of the things we're finding out from some of these abortion clinics is that, first of all, they are saying, want cash, don't want anything else. And then she talks about the question of went to Planned Parenthood where it costs $500 to kill my baby, when she said she was confronted by the pro-life demonstrators outside. And this is maybe a help to some of our pro-life demonstrators who are certainly the front lines of the pro-life movement. She kind of knew in her heart that she was making the wrong decision, but wasn't interested in talking to them because she knew it was a bad choice she was going to take anyway. And so then, as you said, goes into this cold, sterile environment. Everything is unemotional, but when she sees her now aborted baby taken off in a container that says medical waste, I think that was the part where it just kind of broke her heart, didn't it?
Yeah, it did, and I think that's when it really became real to her. Not only that there was a baby in there, it wasn't just the clump of cells that they want you to think, but there was a child. The child was treated, of course, with no dignity, being marked as medical waste, and that they really didn't care about her either. I think it just kind of all came together for her in that moment.
So again, one of the things I think we need to recognize is that there is obviously a very painful experience that women are going through. She even talks about the fact that when she went to the room where you, quote, recover, there were other girls who had abortions. But even though she was maybe emotionally hurting, she spent some of her time trying to actually help those girls who were crying.
Yeah, absolutely. At that point, she was still feeling a little numb, and I think she was in shock from the experience. So she tried to help some of the other women, and then, later is when it really hit her.
Sure. And again, one of the things we're seeing is, as you also talk about here, is kind of the slick marketing that is taking place there. Talk about that for just a minute, because it again is something that if we really did believe in full disclosure and really did believe in true choice, I think a lot of women would find themselves choosing something other than the abortion clinic that they have been convinced that is the only answer to their particular problem.
Sure, and I think that's why so many people are against things like the ultrasounds, and people are pro-choice only if that choice isn't fully informed. They really don't want women to understand what they're signing up for.
Well, this is certainly one aspect of the issue of abortion. And the other that you've been writing about is this idea of the adoption law that has been put forward in the state of Michigan. We have listeners in Michigan, but we have listeners in 40 other states as well. But talk about that, because there are a real need, I think, right now for us to provide alternatives to abortion. And, of course, one of those is adoption. So tell us what's been happening there in Michigan.
Of course, yeah, adoption is, a really important option, as you said, and that's one that Tina really looked into. And, in the end, unfortunately, that's not the choice she made. She was pressured into it, as I said. So in Michigan, there's been a new religious freedom initiative moving forward. Well, not moving forward, it's been signed into law that Christian adoption agencies can refer gay couples to another agency that can work with them without it interfering with their religious beliefs. So it's a great, step for religious freedom. Meanwhile, all children are being served. These adoption agencies work with so many families, and Christian agencies work with so many families, that if they weren't able to work within their religious framework, there are a lot of families that would go unserved and a lot of children that wouldn't be placed into the homes that they need. So this is really a great step for religious freedom and for getting kids in the right place.
And again, it's to put that in perspective for our listeners, let me remind you that when you had the first same-sex marriages in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, that question was raised by Catholic Charities, because for over 100 years, Catholic Charities had been placing children in adoption agencies, but they said, we just, without any kind of a problem, we can in good conscience place those children in same-sex couple relationships, but we would be glad to refer them. And that was not enough for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, so they actually closed down Catholic Charities. And what you have here is the Michigan Governor, Rick Snyder, signed the legislation and signed into law, which would allow Christian adoption agencies to decline referrals if it actually violated their religious beliefs. So on whether it's an issue like abortion or homosexuality, some very significant changes taking place, and we wanted you to know about those. And we've posted some of those articles on our website, pointofview.net. Or, of course, you can also go to thestream.org and find some of these articles. We'll come back, and I want to open up the phones and get some of your comments. Some of you perhaps have some comments about the issue of abortion, what is happening in abortion clinics, and certainly the kind of care or lack thereof that women are facing. And then this whole issue of adoption by gay couples. And if you'd like to join the conversation, let's open the phones and give you a chance to join us. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kirby Anderson.
You know, whenever we have a shooting in America, there is the inevitable call for more gun control, and the focus is usually on the guns rather than the people who are using the guns. In his new book, American Contempt for Liberty, professor and columnist Walter Williams has a previously published column asking, "Are guns the problem?" He reminds us of a few historical facts. A century ago, the National Rifle Association helped establish 73 NRA-affiliated high school rifle clubs. I've even had people call my radio program talking about how they used to bring their rifles to school, set them in the back of the classroom, and go out shooting after class. Walter Williams also writes about gun availability. Catalogs and magazines from the 1940s through the 1960s were full of gun advertisements directed to children and parents. One article provided guidance to parents. The National Shooting Sports Foundation published what every parent should know when a boy or girl wants a gun. The 1902 Sears mail order catalog had 35 pages of firearm advertisements. In previous generations, if you wanted a gun, you could send in your money and the manufacturer would ship the gun to you, or you could walk into a hardware store and buy a gun. Few states even had age restrictions on buying guns. So Walter Williams asked an obvious question. Why at a time in our history when guns were readily available, when a person could just walk into a store or order a gun through the mail, when there were no FBI background checks, no waiting periods, no licensing requirements, was there not the frequency and kind of gun violence that sometimes we see today when access to guns is more restricted? Good question. We can point to other factors, the breakdown of the family, the loss of moral standards, as well as violence on television and the movies. We can make a long list. It isn't the gun that's the problem. It's the person and his or her mind and heart that are usually the problem. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk with Amelia Hamilton. Again, if you'd like to know more about some of these articles, they are available in thestream.org. One that we've posted here, Abortion Clinics Don't Care About the Mother, One Woman's Story. And I thought it was kind of interesting that she said that inside the clinic, they work hard to avoid the reality of the situation. They make you feel like this is normal and natural. It's like the same as getting a checkup at the doctor's office. It's cold, it's sterile, it's unemotional. They do everything they can to make you feel as disconnected from reality as possible. And one of the things, Amelia, they do, and I was not aware of this till I read your article, is they have a video that they encourage them to watch, which is designed to make them feel good about aborting their child. I guess this has developed since a lot of these pregnancy resource centers have had videos trying to describe the fact that you are dealing with a human being inside the womb. But that video is, again, just an attempt to try to lower any of your inhibitions or or allay any of the fears or concerns that you might have. And so this is an article I certainly do encourage people to get a copy of, because it helps us, I think, go into an abortion clinic and have a better understanding of what takes place there. So what about that video? Did you find out anything more from Tina about what was actually on that?
No, I don't know much about that video, but I know I've seen other videos that Planned Parenthood has put out as well, and they usually tend to sort of educational, and I'm doing air quotes that of course you can't see, but they're trying to give people very selective facts to make people think that it's really no big deal to get an abortion. Some of their other educational initiatives are telling young girls about things that they probably don't need to know about.
Yes, for sure.
So
Yeah. And, one of the things that you talk about as well in this article, which, again, I know a number of our listeners are actually pro-life demonstrators, or they work in pregnancy resource clinics and others, so I really encourage them to get an article, is the last part of it then talks about the after effects. And we've talked about this before, women exploited by abortion. That it was later, you said, that her choice began to take a toll on her. She said, you continue to have the hormones flooding your body until one day they stop, and what flows next are the tears, and you can't stop them. They're inevitable. And when Tina's body had put the abortion behind her, she knew that the emotional toll was just beginning. And this is something else that's a real shock to women that go through an abortion clinic. They're never told that you're going to have a sense of loss, of regret, of pain. As a matter of fact, I can open up the phones right now, 1-800-351-1212. And if you want to tell your story, I know that I've had individuals that had abortions back in the 1970s that are still feeling the pain today. And that's another part of your article that I think helps us understand that abortion is just not a one-time event. It sometimes is carried with a woman the rest of her life.
Yeah, absolutely. And this isn't something that can just be done in an afternoon and forgotten. This has been, I think we're coming up on 8 years from the baby's due date, and she still thinks about it all the time.
Well, again, this is an article I wanted to make available to some of you pro-life individuals that are certainly dealing with this on the front lines, and certainly those of you that may be in a pregnancy resource center. That is something that Amelia has provided. One other one I thought I'd get to just real quickly before we let you go, and that is you've also written about it's time for fathers to have rights in abortions. You write quite a bit on the issue of human life and law, and that's another issue that certainly needs to be addressed. And we can see that there are individuals right now that are talking about providing some kind of right for the father to actually intervene. And up until now, it's always been so-called a woman's right and nobody else's. What have you found?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, fathers really, they're expected to really go along with whatever decision the mother makes. And that's not right. It's not reasonable. It's their child as much as the mother's. So for them to have rights, I actually was just reading a piece today about a father who wasn't notified when his girlfriend put their baby up for adoption. So he had to go through a huge legal battle to get his daughter back, who he had, throughout the pregnancy, he had paid for medical bills and worked with the mother, and they'd been a team. She gave birth to the child and didn't tell him, and suddenly the baby was up for adoption. So it's really important to respect the role of a father and to support fathers who want to be there for their children.
And this is going to be, I think, an issue that might be surfacing in the campaign. And the reason for that is that Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker has been willing to sign legislation that would allow a father, except in the case maybe of sexual assault, to sue an abortionist for damages, including personal injuries such as emotional or psychological distress. Now, it comes at two levels. One, the father of the child, or in some cases it could be considered the father of a young daughter, because one of the concerns I've had, Amelia, and we found this from time to time, is sometimes individuals have been able to get an abortion without any kind of parental consent. And this is one that has just caused me to shake my head, because for those of us that have had kids in school, it seemed like all the time I was signing release forms so that my kids could go on a field trip, or so they could participate in this particular athletic event, or whatever it might be. But on the same, for the same token, in a public school, it is possible and has been done where the school nurse would take a child out of class, go to an abortion clinic, take her to an abortion clinic, have her have an abortion, bring her back to school, and nobody would know. Except then if that child had any kind of physical or emotional problems, guess who gets to pay for it? The mother and father that weren't notified in the first place. So it does seem to me that we live in this world where we say you should have to pay for the consequences of your decision, but sometimes individuals have to pay for the consequences of a decision they were never notified about, and that seems to be a real concern.
Absolutely, and this idea that the government is just kind of taking over parental roles and responsibilities, it's just unacceptable. Your parents need need to know what's going on and they need to parent. That can't just be abdicated.
Well, again, one of the things I would say is we really need to start pushing on those issues. And so if nothing else, I wanted to get some people to read some of your articles because you have quite a number that would address some of the issues we address here on Point of View on a regular basis, abortion and the issue of the right of parents. Of course, we just talked about adoption agencies and a variety of other topics. So, again, you can find that at stream.org. And, Amelia, I know that you're going to be writing on a variety of other issues. So tell us a preview of what are going to be some of the other articles we're going to be reading soon.
Gosh, well, I'm always interested in pro-life issues and education. We really need to make sure that we're raising the next generation to understand what America is all about and keep those freedoms. It's important to educate kids. And aside from that, I guess the news of the day, whatever strikes me on that day. So keep checking in at thestream.org to see what we're writing about.
Well, I appreciate that. And John Smirik has been in studio with us. Of course, Jay Richards, we've known him for years. And we've been talking with Amelia Hamilton, and we need to take a break. When we come back, we'll get into a couple of other issues in the news, but I did want to make some of these resources available to you. I know that many of you are on the front lines of the pro-life movement, and these are some resources, especially this very powerful story about Tina that Amelia tells you about. So again, take that, use that in some of the outreach that you are involved with, and I want to equip you as much as possible. Just before we take a break, though, let me mention some of the resources we've made available on our website today. We will spend some time tomorrow talking with Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford, and Jonathan Strickland about what this is going to mean in terms of the rights of individuals who have religious convictions to actually decide to participate or not to participate in same-sex marriage. And so one of the articles that we are certainly putting in your hands, and one of the action items we're encouraging you to participate in, is the take action item that we have there, the First Amendment Defense Act. Now, we'll be the first to admit that it doesn't solve all of the problems, but at least it is a way in which you can begin to protect churches and pastors. But even as we had Michael Ferris on, he pointed out that won't really protect a Christian school like his or others. So there's a lot more we need to do. But this is a first attempt to try to at least address those issues. And it is a very significant way that would prohibit the government from penalizing people for their conviction that the Bible defines marriage as one man and one woman. And this would be a way to protect individuals and churches, especially your pastor. And I'm going to come back to that in just a minute because there's some other things happening in that regard that we'll get to in just a minute. But if you have not taken an action on this particular item, let me encourage you to do so. There is a place for you to put your name and address that will then surface your 2 United States senators and your representative. We have a suggested email comment, and you can take that then and pass that on to your elected representatives. We've made it very easy, and so we encourage you to visit the website pointofview.net and find out a little bit more. David French has written about this today, about whether or not churches are going to face some of this, so we'll talk about that. We'll also take some of your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. All that coming up right after this.
Point of View's fiscal year ended last week, and the mailroom, well, they're still tallying up the final gifts to come in, even today, even within the last hour. So we still don't know an exact total, but what we do know, it looks like we met the full match. You stepped up, you gave, and other friends doubled your gift, and for all of that, we continue to be most grateful. Thank you. Point of View is your voice for truth, and your gifts help us continue keeping you informed and equipped for the challenges and opportunities of our time. Thank you one more time for partnering with us. And if you missed out, I assure you your support remains needed in this year. You can still give at pointofview.net. By mail, Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221, or by phone 800-347-5151. That's 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Thank you.
Point of View will continue after this. are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I'll leave this last half hour kind of as an open line. We've talked about everything from arguments for the existence of God and science, as well as we've talked about abortion and adoption clinics and much, much more. We're going to get into how to protect our pastors and churches in just a minute, but let's take some phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out to South Carolina first, WAGP. And Jerry, what would you like to say today?
Two things. One, my sister is the vice president of South Carolina Citizens for Life, and she informed me that there are more parents waiting to adopt than there are children being murdered and aborted. Excuse me.
Sure, and that's very true. Very true. Yes, go ahead.
I hadn't realized that. I thought it was, a big disparity. Two, I raised 4 boys, so it never hit me directly. But last comment you made before the break,
yes,
school nurse taking a girl, killing her baby, and then bringing her back. I pictured what would happen if that happened in my family. I'm very close to my children. I would notice this. My first reaction was a little bit too Old Testament to be realistic, to be workable.
I think that would have been mine, too, yes.
But
I know what you're saying.
I thought, and is this possible, could I go down there with a lawyer and sue the school nurse and the principal into bankruptcy for wrongful death?
I think so. And we, over the years, have talked about the legal liability of churches and schools and nonprofits and others that have done certain things. Now when I talk about churches, I'm talking about liberal churches because, others wouldn't do that. But various groups and sometimes the schools themselves. We've talked a great deal about the legal liability of schools, number one, because of having these school-based clinics and actually distributing contraceptives. What if you have a child that has any kind of medical problem because you gave those contraceptives to the child without the parent's knowledge? What happens in, of course, the extreme case, which I just talked about, and there are those cases out there in which a nurse has been able to sneak a child out to get an abortion and bring them back. What about those? And then we've talked about even the legal liability of teaching about homosexuality and, all the so-called anti-bullying programs sometimes that were nothing more than a thinly disguised attempt to promote homosexuality, and then they get a sexually transmitted disease or all of the rest. I think the legal liability of some of these schools is huge, and they are really walking a very dangerous line, hoping that everything turns out and that most parents won't take the whole area of legal action against the schools because they're liable. The various clinics are liable. Even some of these more liberal churches that have counseled young people to, it's okay to have sex or whatever. I mean, just think of the liability that you have when you give that kind of information or even take an individual to an abortion clinic. I'm surprised we haven't had more of those lawsuits in the country, but you're absolutely right on target there, Jerry.
I wish that you would press the legal liability and how to go about it with some of your experts more. I'm becoming a teacher. I talked with a few weeks. You sent me a fantastic book, Christian Ethics in Plain Language. The thing is, most school administrators, because of lawsuits from bullies and liberals, do not support their teachers.
Yes.
The Christian right needs to strike back using the same effective weapons.
Well, let me, since I apparently gave you a free book, if you stay on the line, I'll give you another free book, because it's this book that I wrote, A Biblical Point of View on Homosexuality, and on chapter, it's page 47 and 48 and 49, it's what is the potential legal liability of homosexual education. I can't give you one on abortion at the moment, but I do have that one right in front of me, it so happens, and this comes from people that have written about all sorts of legal liability on the issue of teaching about the fact that homosexuality is normal and natural, because first of all, you have the issue of life expectancy. Second, you have the question about sexually transmitted diseases, and that applies both to the school-based clinics as well as some of the homosexual education. And then the other with the health risk behaviors and the issue of mental health. So I go into that in some detail in that particular chapter, and it's, I guess, chapter 4 of the book, A Biblical Point of View on Homosexuality. So since I've been so generous and gave you one book, how about I give you a second one here? So stay on the line. Catherine will talk to you, and you get a free book. How's that?
I appreciate that.
Yeah, I appreciate you calling in. And since I'm so generous, I'll give away some other free books today. But let's, if we can, Catherine, let's put him on hold and give you a chance to interact with him and find his address. Then let me get to one other issue before I take some more phone calls. Again, fair game in this last half hour. If you want to talk about abortion, want to talk about adoption, some of the issues we just addressed. Of course, we also talked just a minute ago about science and certainly arguments for the existence of God. But I did want to get one other topic, and it relates to our action item, and that is the First Amendment Defense Act. David French, who's been on the program with us before, I need to get him back. He wrote today, for churches that won't perform same-sex weddings, insurance begins to look iffy. And he says, in the aftermath of this Supreme Court decision, pastors and church members are experiencing a wave of anxiety over what many of them deem to be the nightmare scenario. What is that? Well, that would be lawsuits or government action designed to force them to perform or recognize same-sex marriages. Well, there are so far no meaningful judicial precedents that would permit such dramatic inference with churches' core First Amendment rights. Lawsuits challenging civil liberties and church liberties are inevitable. He says, indeed, the Iowa Civil Rights Commission has declared that prohibitions against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, don't you love this, sometimes apply to churches, and has stated that a church service open to the public is not a bona fide religious purpose that would limit application of the law. You go back to 2012, a New Jersey administrative law judge ruled that a religious organization closely associated with the United Methodist Church wrongly denied access to its facilities for a same-sex wedding. And so David French goes on to say that churches, like virtually every functioning corporation, protect against liability risk and the potential ruinous cost of litigation through liability insurance. If you're not familiar with that, if you sit on various boards, and my wife will tell you I probably sit on more boards than any person should, and I need to get off of some of those, but if you sit on a board, oftentimes there's liability insurance to protect board members, and obviously there is liability insurance to protect churches and Christian groups and all sorts of things. Well, anyway, he goes on to say that with same-sex marriage now recognized as a constitutional right, and with news of Oregon's Bureau of Labor and Industries awarding a lesbian couple $135,000 in damages for emotional, mental, and physical suffering after a Christian bakery, and that would be Aaron and Melissa Klein, for refusing to bake their wedding cake, pastors are reaching out to insurance companies to make sure they're covered, and at least one insurer has responded with peremptory denial. That is, no coverage if a church is sued for refusing to perform a same-sex wedding. Okay, well, that's kind of sending a signal to some of the homosexual activists. I'm not saying all homosexuals would do this, but I am saying that there are certain activists that have targeted churches in the past. Certainly these homosexual activists have targeted what? Photographers and bakers and florists and wedding venues for this. And this is saying that we would not cover you. And so now we're starting to see that some of the insurance companies, because again, they're in the business to make money and they're not going to lose money, are saying, you know, we will cover you for various liability. For example, if you preach against an issue or somebody says you're liable because you said something that might have caused some distress. But we're not going to cover you if indeed you do not allow same-sex marriages within your church. And so I think we're back to a couple of things that need to happen real quickly. The First Amendment Defense Act, which we're encouraging your action on, all that really does, although it is significant, is that it prohibits
a government agency from withdrawing your tax-exempt status or requiring that you accept same-sex marriage on a license or a certification. But that is different than this issue about whether or not an insurance company would actually cover you for liability if your church decided that it would not perform a same-sex marriage ceremony. What that means is that they would bring suit against the church. Doesn't even necessarily mean that they would win, but it does mean that the church would then have to undergo the cost to have to defend itself. And so I think it is illustrating again that we're in kind of this no man's land, and we're going to have to think through what that means. If that isn't a perfect setup for what we're going to talk about tomorrow with Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford and Jonathan Strickland, I don't know what else will. Matter of fact, Jonathan Strickland was one of the people that came up with the pastor protection law, so we'll talk more about the protection the state of Texas has provided to pastors, but there's a lot more that would need to take place. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take some more calls right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Don't forget that tomorrow at our Friday weekend edition, we'll have Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford, also Jonathan Strickland. He has been a representative in the state of Texas, one of the individuals that put forward the pastor protection law. We'll have a chance to hear from him about how we can protect pastors and churches. And that's our next question. So we'll go out to California, KYCC. Charles, thank you for calling. What's your question for us today?
I would like to know, we already guaranteed, my brother, in the Constitution, freedom of choice, and we're already guaranteed freedom of expression. Now, if this is guaranteed to us, then why are we trying to tell the preacher that he can't say what his job is to say? That's not bombarding gays or homosexuals. That's just teaching them or telling them another way of life. And I'm not understanding this. And another thing, I don't know if you guys can do this, but we should push for more Christians, men and women, all denominations, to run for political office.
Well,
The Bible
for
says
that.
yield.
Yeah.
The Bible says yield the salt to the earth. God's going to hold us responsible for this earth. So we need to get more men and women of God, all ethnicities up there, and turn this thing around.
Well, thank you for that comment, and that's certainly one of the things I have noticed when I, from time to time, interview some people. We talked about when we had Jeremy Dyes in here the other day. He said, I was listening to Point of View when I was in grade school, which, by the way, made me feel really old, but nevertheless, and now he's a lawyer. Of course, we've had Michelle Bachmann was listening since she was 19 years of age and ran for the state Senate, and of course, eventually ran for Congress and even ran for the presidency. So we certainly are seeing some of those, but we need a lot more. But Charles, you have a very good question. Let me try to answer it. First of all, if you really believed in the Constitution and you really believe that the Constitution protects churches, because after all, the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law establishing religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof, you would say that Congress can't do anything, or by extension, the federal government or even state governments can't do anything to affect the churches. And the theory used to be that churches were free to do and believe whatever they wanted to because the government really does not have the expertise to evaluate the theological perspective that a church might have. But I saw two places where that inroad took place in the 1980s, which eventually led us to where we are today. And back in the 1980s, I was only occasionally kind of a guest host on Point of View. So one of the things I tended to do a lot more back then was write newspaper columns. And some of you have read those in the Dallas Morning News, the Houston Post, the San Jose Mercury, the Miami Herald, wherever it was. And one of the stories I wrote about had to do with these scarlet letter lawsuits. That were saying that if indeed a church exercised Matthew 18 kind of church discipline, that it allowed the church to do that, but then it also allowed the government to go in and say, maybe you didn't do that the right way, which I thought was, first of all, a very significant intrusion into that. At the same time, there was what was called a clergy malpractice lawsuit that was brought against John MacArthur. And again, he eventually settled it, but it was the idea that, well, wait a minute, the government should not evaluate the theology of John MacArthur, which, by the way, I think is very orthodox, but it was using that to say that because one individual committed suicide, maybe there was something in the teaching of John MacArthur that led to that. And so those intrusions were kind of minor, but the major one, which relates back to this First Amendment Defense Act, was the one having to do with Bob Jones University. Now, at that time in the 1980s, Bob Jones University did not allow interracial dating. I didn't agree with it, but that's not the point. The point was the government said, we have the right to withdraw your tax-exempt status because your particular belief, religiously held, I think erroneously, but nevertheless, originally religiously held, is enough for us to withdraw your tax-exempt status. So, Charles, back to the point you're making, we've had a couple of times in the 1980s where the government said, no, we think we can look at your sermons, we can look at what you teach, we can look at what you preach about, we can even see what your doctrinal statement is, and if it doesn't fit with what we think is in the public interest, we have the right to allow a person to sue you, allow a person to bring a clergy malpractice lawsuit against you, or even allow the federal government to remove your tax-exempt status. And I'm looking for, back to your point, Charles, some people of faith and really just some people of common sense to say, wait a minute, by definition, government is not equipped to evaluate the theology of the church. And it's time for us really to say there really does need to be a separation of the institutions of church and state and not have the government interfere. Would you agree?
I agree.
Well, that's a quick answer, maybe even longer answer than you wanted to why we are where we are, but I think it illustrates the point only so well. And it illustrates something that I have done a commentary on that'll come out next week, in which I point out that we're going to see the secular society come more and more in our direction because, first of all, we have seen that shortly after the Supreme Court decision on same-sex marriage, you had Mark Oppenheimer writing in Time magazine, quote, "Now's the time to end tax exemption for religious institutions." And that came out just days afterwards. Then you began to see how people were calling for the redefinition of marriage. Politico ran an editorial, "It's time to legalize polygamy, why group marriage is the next horizon of social liberalism." And the argument is that, well, the number of people that believe in polygamy have doubled since 2001. You have already pretty much said that we can redefine marriage. And even, interestingly enough, Chief Justice John Roberts said in his court decision, quote, "Although the majority randomly inserts the adjective to in various places, it offers no reason as to why the two-person element of the core definition of marriage may be preserved while the man-woman element may not," unquote. So as we'll probably spend some time talking about tomorrow, there has been a very significant drumbeat, not just for same-sex marriage, but for polygamy, for plural marriage. And as I've said on this program before, it doesn't take any kind of imagination to see where this is going to lead. We don't have to use, quote, slippery slope arguments. We see people right now going to court saying, well, now that we've redefined marriage, let's redefine it so that it allows for plural marriage. And since, indeed, some people are not going to go along with this decision, let's pull their tax-exempt status. And so a lot of those newspaper columns I wrote back in the 1980s are now coming to fruition. And this is why I think it's even more important for us to pay attention to who we elect to office. So tomorrow, as Charles mentioned, we're going to have Jonathan Strickland in here, a very outstanding Christian who has been in the Texas legislature that gave us the Pastor Protection Bill. And I think it's a model piece of legislation that other states need to adopt. And then we'll also be talking with Kelly Shackelford about the defense of religious liberty. Penna Dexter will be with us, and we think that this is going to be the next battleground. And so if you believe in what we're doing here, I hope that you will tune in every single day. Hope that you will support this ministry in your prayers and your financial support. And take the time to visit the website, because we are giving you more and more articles and commentaries and videos and others to help you be more effective in your community to fight for some of these very important issues. Well, that's all we have for today. I want to thank you for joining the program. And if you'd like to listen to any of these again, you can download our podcast or send them on to some other individuals. Engineering for us today, Abby, thank you for your help. Andrew is, well, helping. And, of course, want to thank Catherine and Chris, all those behind the scenes that have made this program possible today. One last time, don't forget that there's an opportunity for you to support the Cradle Fund. There is a Take Action element, First Amendment Defense Act, and tomorrow is our weekend edition. We'll see you then.
Point of View's fiscal year ended last week, and the mailroom, well, they're still tallying up the final gifts to come in, even today, even within the last hour. So we still don't know an exact total, but what we do know, it looks like we met the full match. You stepped up, you gave, and other friends doubled your gift, and for all of that, we continue to be most grateful. Thank you. Point of View is your voice for truth, and your gifts help us continue keeping you informed and equipped for the challenges and opportunities of our time. Thank you one more time for partnering with us. And if you missed out, I assure you your support remains needed in this year. You can still give at pointofview.net. By mail, Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221, or by phone 800-347-5151. That's 800-347-5151. 51 and pointofview.net. Thank you. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.